While researching our last video on Dorothy Thompson, we came across another amazing woman in American journalism. Helen Thomas was born in Winchester, Kentucky, the seventh of 9 children. Her immigrant parents from Lebanon moved the family to Detroit when Thomas was still young. Thomas earned her bachelor's in English at Wayne University in 1942, and then almost immediately moved to Washington, D.C., working as a copy girl at Washington Daily News. Thomas was fired from the paper 8 months later for joining her colleagues in a strike, setting the populist tone that marked the rest of her career. The following year, Thomas then joined United Press. She originally only reported on women's topics for its radio wire service. A wire service is a news agency that gathers stories and then either reports them or sells them to other news outlets. So like the Associated Press, the brand flakes of news. UPI used to be a competitor of the AP. But you know, media consolidation. Thomas pushed United Press to allow her to cover more political stories, and in 1955, she was assigned to cover the Justice Department. She was in the Supreme Court that May when the historic Brown v. Board of Education decision was handed down, a story she would later call the greatest she ever covered. Thomas gained a reputation for speaking her mind and leading by example. In 1959, Thomas, along with some female colleagues, forced the National Press Club to lift their bar on women so they could attend the address of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. That same year, she became president of the Women's National Press Club. Hi, my name is Doriel. This channel was born because me and my husband both studied history in college and don't feel like we have much to show for it. In order to put our overpriced degrees to good use, we decided to use this channel to combat the widespread misinformation being churned out across the internet. That way, we didn't do all that work for nothing. Helen Thomas's career changed forever in 1960, during the presidential election between JFK and Nixon. Once Kennedy's nomination was assured, Thomas began covering the Kennedy family, particularly Jacqueline Kennedy, who was becoming a rising star. After JFK's victory in November, Thomas stayed with the president-elect and his family all the way into the White House, eventually becoming a correspondent for UPI in 1961. Thomas's career in the White House press corps lasted through 10 presidents, starting with Kennedy and ending the second year of Obama's first term.
Helen, this is my inaugural moment here.
She received endearing monikers such as the Sitting Buddha and First Lady of the Press. Thomas also brought back the tradition of ending press conferences with "Thank you, Mr. President," formally started under FDR's presidency. For those of you who aren't aware, the White House holds press conferences where they provide the press information on executive policy and take questions from reporters. These conferences were informally started under Teddy Roosevelt, who invited reporters out of the rain to a cloakroom in the West Wing. Before this, the press typically served almost more as paparazzi, waiting outside the White House and reporting who came in and who came out. Since Roosevelt's kind gesture, the relationship between journalists and the president has become far more intimate and impactful. The relationship grew with Franklin Roosevelt, who often gave reporters a ton of juicy information and good quotes, while strategically putting some of what he said off the record. These press conferences can be the scene of some pretty intense moments.
Guys, hold on a second.
And some absolute comedy.
This was the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration, period.
All right, any other questions?
Yeah, just mentally though. Are you okay?
Kidding me? Are you
Because Helen worked for a wire service that was expected to get news out to other sources as quickly as possible, she would often follow in the presidential motorcade, going everywhere the president went. This became known as the body watch, because it was their literal job to make sure the president didn't drop dead, or worse, he dropped dead and it wasn't reported. This closeness, of course, also sparked animosity. Jackie Kennedy even once called Thomas and her fellow members of the Women's National Press Club harpies. By 1962, Helen settled into her new role at the White House, getting, as she called it, a ringside seat to instant history. Thomas had a tenacious attitude toward her work. No story was too big and no story was too small. Like the time she called Kennedy's press secretary, Pierre Salinger, at 3 a.m. to confirm her scoop that Caroline Kennedy's hamster had died. The press secretary is usually the person the White House sends out to deal with the press. The current press secretary is Caroline Leavitt. The press secretary usually goes on to have some pointless job like on MSNBC, Dancing with the Stars, or governor of Arkansas. After almost 3 years of nonstop work, Thomas was preparing for a much-needed vacation in the fall of 1963 when she heard about Kennedy's assassination. She dropped everything and flew to Dallas. Thomas was quoted years later speaking about how fast the transition was between JFK and LBJ at the White House. They start moving the furniture out of the Oval Office on the day of the assassination. She followed LBJ during his infamous sporadic and mobile press conferences, which she called baton death marches, that on occasion made a detour to the bathroom where Johnson would continue the briefing while on the toilet.
So if you were in the bedroom holding back when he went into the bathroom, he would just call you in and say, "Come on in, I haven't finished what I'm saying."
Before the White House briefing room was built, the press would interview the president or a member of the staff in locations all over the White House. This served to give the executive branch a sense of control in those briefings, and according to Thomas, LBJ sought control in every interaction. Thomas recounted the White House press corps had a love-hate relationship with Johnson. She recalled how the old Texan would put the press in their place by calling his dogs over first and then the reporters. His bombastic and domineering personality was legendary. One time, he allegedly pulled out his little Johnson in front of journalists when being grilled about the Vietnam War. Thomas found herself on the wrong end of Johnson's ire in 1965 when she broke the news of his youngest daughter Lucy's engagement. Since she was the only woman in the White House for UPI, she was expected to cover the First Lady on top of her other duties. Helen followed Lady Bird Johnson on a 4-day, 1,682-mile whistle-stop tour through the South during the 1964 campaign. Johnson's support of civil rights made the South a hostile location for Democrats that election. Barry Goldwater was threatening to become the first Republican to win the Deep South since Reconstruction. In order to quell this potential mutiny, LBJ sent Lady Bird to stump for the campaign. According to Thomas, the trek between D.C. and New Orleans was pretty bitter medicine for the First Lady. She remembered seeing several Goldwater signs along the way, some of which with derogatory slogans like "Lady Bird is a blackbird." Despite this, Thomas believes Mrs. Johnson won a lot of admirers for her husband during the tour, mostly through sheer determination and grace. The Johnson years also marked a change in journalism. The information given by the White House on the war in Vietnam was increasingly contradictory to the truth on the ground. News outlets began exploring this credibility gap and finding more and more evidence that the government was actively deceiving the American people. As this golden age of investigative journalism took off, so did Thomas's career. In 1970, she was named UPI's chief White House correspondent. She was also one of a group of reporters handpicked to follow Nixon on his historic visit to China in 1972, and the only woman in print journalism allowed on the trip. Her biggest story, and possibly the one she is most known for, came from her relationship with Martha Mitchell, wife to Nixon's Attorney General John Mitchell. Martha Mitchell was a huge personality, allegedly being the second most in-demand person at Republican events, only behind the president. While typically an outspoken advocate for conservative causes, like the time she shouted out her window at protesters in front of the White House, Martha never shied away from speaking her mind. Thomas recalled one interaction the two had on Air Force One.
And so the men were playing cards, and I don't know what I was doing. She came by, and I said hi, and I said, "Well, you know, what do you think of the miniskirts? Why don't you ask me something important?" I said, "Okay, what do you think of the Vietnam War?" She said, "It stinks." The men stopped playing cards and grabbed their notebooks. We all started scribbling. When we landed, everybody ran to the phone.
Oh, that's funny.
And she was barred then from Air Force One.
Martha was friendly with reporters and would often give bits of information she gathered by eavesdropping on her husband's phone calls. John Mitchell would resign as Attorney General in 1972 and take over the committee to re-elect the president, or creep. From there, he organized the notorious covert operations against Nixon's political enemies, known as rat fucking. The Mitchells were in LA for a Republican fundraiser when members of the CRP were caught breaking into the Democratic campaign headquarters at the Watergate Hotel. When John realized one of the burglars was Martha's former head of security, John McCord, he arranged for his wife to stay in California under close supervision while he returned to D.C. to assist in the cover-up. It took Martha all of one day to get her hands on a newspaper and see McCord's name attached to the growing scandal. She then called her favorite White House reporter. Martha was discussing the dirty business her husband was involved in for the campaign when suddenly Thomas heard Martha yelling at someone else in the room with her. Unknown to Helen, Martha was yelling at former FBI agent and member of John Mitchell's security detail, Steve King, who overheard Martha, then broke into her room and ripped the phone out of the wall. King then proceeded to physically restrain her, deny her food and water, and drugged her for days. Thomas tried to call Martha back, but after no answer and no help from the hotel desk, she called John Mitchell, who told the UPI reporter, "That little sweetheart. I love her so much. She gets a little upset about politics, but she loves me, and I love her, and that's what counts." After almost a week in captivity, Martha desperately scaled the side of her hotel to reach the phone in the room next door. She immediately called Thomas to inform her of her capture and of McCord's involvement with the Nixon White House. Thomas recorded the story, and UPI sold it to the New York Times, but it was relegated to the women's section on the bottom of page 12. Thomas persisted, even while Nixon told other members of the press that Mitchell was an alcoholic and everything she said was false.
Was she a crazy lady? I certainly don't think so. I think she was visionary, prophetic. She was the first to say Nixon should resign.
Thomas continued to turn the heat up on Tricky Dick.
Testified that you said it would be wrong to pay hush money to silence the Watergate defendant.
Well, Ms. Thomas, it would be improper, as of course you know, for me to comment on the substance of any...
Despite Nixon's best efforts, the Watergate story didn't go away. When asked about Watergate in a 2006 interview, Thomas answered, "Nothing could put Humpty Dumpty back together again. It was darkness at noon at the White House for several months before it actually happened. But you always knew the other shoe was going to fall. And it wasn't the question of the press going after him. It was life itself. No matter what the Nixon Library claims." Watergate changed the media's relationship with the presidency forever. A colleague recalled that after the scandal, Thomas stated no politician would ever get the benefit of the doubt from the press again. Thomas rejected the idea that presidents had some special access to information. As far as she was concerned, the American public had as much right to it as anyone else. The same year Nixon resigned, Thomas was promoted to UPI's White House bureau chief. Helen built a reputation for asking tough questions and always holding the executive branch to account.
There have been reports that you were told directly or indirectly at least twice that the Contras were benefiting from the Iran arms sale. Is that true, or were you deceived and lied to by Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North? And I'd like to follow on. Mr. President, you didn't answer the question on North or Poindexter. Did they deceive you?
President, you've always said that you were not targeting Saddam under the UN mandate, and that the coalition has no claim on Iraqi territory. Is that still the case?
Mr. President, in view of a new court ruling, Monica Lewinsky may have to appear before a grand jury. Under the circumstances, do you stand by your previous denials of any relationship with her, or that anyone encouraged her to lie?
When are you going to get out of Afghanistan? Why are you continuing to kill and die there? What is the real excuse? And don't give us this Bushism, if we don't go there, they'll all come here.
This was necessary to satisfy a skeptical public, still healing from Watergate and Vietnam. Thomas's direct, unrelenting style gave many Americans a sense of pride that theirs was a democracy where the press stood up to power and questioned their leaders. Helen Thomas was an institution in the White House. Her career became a symbol that presidents were temporary, the people were eternal. Presidents continued to embrace Thomas's pugnacious but good faith grilling into the 21st century. But in 2001, Thomas would face her toughest test.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Too many OBGYNs aren't able to practice their love with women all across this country. I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
As Texas governor, Bush was ripped to shreds by the press for his intellect. or lack thereof, shaping his relationship with the media as one of opposition and disdain. Thanks to Bush's unwelcome attitude towards members of the press, his administration came down hard on any sort of opposition from them. He went particularly hard on Helen, who was used to sitting in the front spot and opening press briefings with the first question.
Miss Thomas, I think you're number one tonight, as usual.
She was preemptively moved to the back row because, according to her, she asked too many mean questions. Her tough questions intensified in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. Thomas's new role as a columnist allowed her to express her opinions freely. She used this new position to warn everyone of the insanity Bush and his war hawks were proposing. In a time when it was seen as un-American to say anything against the U.S. attacking whoever they damn well pleased, Helen Thomas spoke up.
Saddam Hussein is his white whale. The Bush policy of preemptive war is immoral. Historian Arthur Schlesinger put it well. He said that such a policy would legitimatize Pearl Harbor. So it's once more into the breach, with none of the lessons learned since Vietnam.
In January 2003, just weeks before the invasion, Thomas got into hot water after telling a reporter that she was covering the worst president in history. The next day, she was not called on at all by the White House press team for the first time since the 1960s. Thomas wrote the administration an apology letter and was given a diminished role. Bush did not call on her directly again until 2006 as punishment. But when he finally did, Helen didn't hold back.
Helen.
You're going to be sorry. Your decision to invade Iraq has caused the deaths of thousands of Americans and Iraqis, wounds of Americans and Iraqis for a lifetime. Every reason given, publicly at least, has turned out not to be true. My question is, why did you really want to go to war? From the moment you stepped into the White House, from your cabinet, former cabinet officers, intelligent people, and so forth. What was your real reason? You have said it wasn't oil, quest for oil. It hasn't been Israel or anything else. What was it?
Helen did make her way back to the front row eventually, and in 2007, Bush even gave her the first question of his press conference, and of course, she let him have it again.
Starting with Miss Thomas.
President, you started this war, the war of your choosing, and you can end it alone today. At this point, bring in peacekeepers, UN peacekeepers. 2 million Iraqis have fled their country as refugees. 2 million more are displaced. Thousands and thousands are dead. Don't you understand? We brought the Al-Qaeda into Iraq.
When the squeaky clean, unknown senator from Chicago, Barack Obama, was elected in 2008, she went back to business as usual. She also once again ended conferences with her signature, "Thank you, Mr. President," for the first time in 8 long years. On May 27, 2010, Thomas was on the north lawn of the White House sitting on a bench when she was asked for a brief virtual interview with Rabbi David Nesanoff of RabbiLive.com to celebrate Jewish Heritage Day. After being asked a few questions about her career in journalism and advice for any aspiring young reporters, Thomas was asked about her views on Israel.
Tell them to get the hell out of Palestine.
Anyone who had followed her career knew she was a consistent critic of the actions of the Israeli government. However, when Thomas did what she had always done and answered honestly, the backlash was severe. Part of this has to do with the time period. Helen's defense of Palestinians during press briefings might have been on C-SPAN, but that didn't end up on 2010's YouTube. Thomas failed to defend her opinion in follow-up interviews. Despite eventually apologizing for her remarks, Helen was forced to retire less than a month later. Helen Thomas's long and fearless career as a hard-hitting journalist is something we don't really see in mainstream media today. The capitulation of the press to the American government is a dangerous reality we are currently living in.
Will you guys also consider releasing the president's fitness plan? He actually looks healthier than ever before.
I want to talk more about the success that ICE is having.
The relationship with the press and the current administration is a stark contrast to the many years of work that Helen Thomas fought to uphold. After September 11th, Thomas accused many of her fellow reporters of being in a state of passive stupor by not challenging anything the administration was saying as they steered the country towards devastating forever wars. Journalists began to push back on issues less and less, giving the White House more unchecked power. She criticized the press for being lapdogs to the powerful, rather than being servants to the public. Thomas would go on to write several books touching on the decline of journalistic integrity. She believed that persistent journalistic integrity is the backbone to a strong democracy. Gerald Ford once said of Helen Thomas, "If God made the world in 6 days, he wouldn't have rested on the 7th because he would have had to answer to Helen Thomas." A strong and independent media is the most effective way to get transparency from the ruling class. The tentacles of corporations have found their way into what were once trusted sources for the American public to rely on. More and more, the responsibility to stand up to power and question the actions and motives of those in power has fallen to smaller independent sources. As we stated in previous episodes, large media conglomerates now find it more profitable to be a mouthpiece for the government rather than informing the public. Laws like the 1996 Telecommunications Act made the monopolization of news outlets inevitable. But we know there are so many of us out there dedicated to the truth. So many of us feel like our heads are going to explode as lie after lie after lie is accepted by media institutions with minimal pushback. Even the slightest indication of a spine by established journalists is praiseworthy in an era where the press has an ever-shrinking footprint in American politics. Many sources that claim independence are either 1, actively deceiving us, or 2, completely shirk their responsibility and allow the wealthy and powerful to use them like flesh puppets to achieve a maniacal end. There is a great misconception from many in the press that being civil and asking tough questions that make people uncomfortable is incompatible. Nothing could be further from the truth, and Helen Thomas proved that. In reality, the more we make the wealthy and powerful comfortable, the less civility there will be around the world. To any aspiring future journalists out there, take some notes from Helen Thomas's book. Question everything and don't back down.
I'm not going to change character because I'm called names or anything. That would be ridiculous. If I wanted to suck up and belong to the club, I would have done that a long time ago.
As always, thank you for watching. If you found any of this informative, please give it a like, tell us what you thought in the comments, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Until next time, please remember, the future is ahead of us. Bye.